You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Military innovation seems to be the ubiquitous term these days for just a good idea. Everyone seems to be driving an innovation program. But what does military innovation do to the political structures and cultures of a nation, of the international scene, and the relationships between allies and competitors? I have no answers. G'day listeners, it's your host Mick here and welcome back to another episode of The Dead Prussian. Thanks very much for all the iTunes reviews. Thank you very much for the support, those people that have slung donations through our support button on the website. And also, thank you very much to those people who are purchasing some of our high-priced quality merchandise. Remember, overpriced is for bad quality. If it's high-priced and high quality, it's not overpriced. That being said, I haven't bought any of it myself. Look, today we're going to talk about military innovation. And I know a little bit about it, but probably not enough to actually educate you all. Or if I'm in Southern America, you all. So what I have done is I have asked a guest to come on the show and talk about military innovation and how it affects international politics. My guest today is Michael C. Horowitz. He is an Associate Professor of Political Science and the Associate Director of Perry Weld House at the University of Pennsylvania. He recently received the 2017 Karl Deutsch Award from the International Studies Association. It's presented annually to a scholar under the age of 40 who's judged to have made the most significant contribution to the study of international relations and peace research. Kind of a big deal. Professor Horowitz is the co-author of the book Why Leaders Fight and his award-winning first book, the topic for today, The Diffusion of Military Power, Causes and Consequences for International Politics. His research interests include technology and global politics, military innovation, the role of leaders in international politics, and forecasting. He's published in a wide array of peer-reviewed journals as well as more popular outlets such as the New York Times and Politico, two publications yet to accept my letters to the editor. He previously worked for the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Department of Defense. That's a pretty complicated branch name. He is affiliated with the Foreign Policy Research Institute, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Center for a New American Security. He is also a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's held fellowships at the Weatherhead Center, Olin Institute, and Belfer Center at Harvard, where he received his PhD in government. Professor Horowitz received his BA in Political Science from Emory University. It's pretty complex. Hopefully today he'll shed some light on another complex topic. Mike, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on a show that combines two of my favorite things, Clausewitz and issues surrounding Australia. Since you may not know this, but one of the first articles I ever published was about the importance of the U.S.-Australian alliance.
And did it say that it was more important to Australia than it was to the U.S.?
It said it was very important to the U.S., and the U.S. needed to be more supportive of its friend and partner down under.
Excellent. That was actually a test you passed. You can continue on with the interview.
Whew, it's great.
Now, Mike, before we discuss military innovation, politics, diffusion theories, and everything else I don't understand, can you tell our listeners a little bit about what got you interested in international politics and writing on military innovation and technology in particular?
Thanks, Mick. I mean, it all started when I was 5 years old. I'm just kidding.
Good.
To be honest, it's a combination of a little bit of curiosity about my dad, great mentors, and a bunch of random chance. My father actually worked for Raytheon, the defense contractor, for almost his entire career designing missile guidance systems, which got me interested in some ways in weapons technologies and international security issues. I was then really fortunate to have a terrific set of mentors sort of during and after college. Dan Reiter at Emory University, who taught my Intro to IR class. And then when I graduated from college, I stumbled into CSIS and was fortunate enough to learn at the feet of Kirk Campbell and Michelle Flournoy, who managed to keep me employed for a year and help me get into graduate school, where Stephen Rosen, who wrote one of the books about military innovation, helped show me the ropes. But the kinds of questions that have always interested me are questions with great relevance to the real world, and where the rigor of an academic approach has the potential to shed some unique light on a topic. And military innovation has always seemed, to me at least, to be something where that qualifies.
It's a pretty interesting story, actually. I don't think we've had a guest whose father designed guidance systems for missiles. Was that right?
Yeah, he worked on the Hawk, if you remember that air defense system.
Yeah.
He worked on the PAC-2, the original Patriot. He worked on the SM-3, the naval missile defense system.
Yeah.
He just retired a few years ago.
Wow, and knowing Raytheon, he probably had like one of those badges that just said the original Patriot, which is really cool if you think about it, like just as a slogan. Yeah. We could talk about missiles all day, actually, because it's a big love of mine, things that fly through the air and explode. But we're gonna get deep into the theory. Can you give us a little bit of an explanation about your theory of the diffusion of military power?
Sure. So, my first book was called The Diffusion of Military Power, and it's foremost about military innovation, which I think about as changes in the conduct of war designed to increase the ability of militaries to convert, capabilities into power. So this isn't just about technological change, or even primarily about technological change. It's about the ability of organizations, since war is a human endeavor, to employ military capabilities. And then as a secondary matter, I think the diffusion of military power is all about adoption capacity, which is a term I use in my writing, and in this book in particular, to talk about the match between the financial and organizational requirements for adopting a new kind of military innovation and the capabilities that a particular country might have. Because if you think about a military innovation out there, things can vary. Take something like Blitzkrieg, which we think about as a classic military innovation.
Yeah.
The financial requirements for adopting Blitzkrieg to having like tanks, trucks, etc., actually not that high. If you look at the various militaries prior to the Second World War, a lot of them have tanks, a lot of them have trucks, a lot of them have all the component parts of Blitzkrieg. Mm-hmm. But from an organizational perspective, it's actually extremely complicated. It involves shifting how militaries thought about how to fight. This focus on deep penetration and breakthroughs, the focus on combined arms, and so the organizational requirements for adopting Blitzkrieg were actually pretty high.
Yeah.
And so what my sort of argument and what my writing is often about is about that gap between the technology and the ability of militaries to effectively employ technologies and adopt innovations.
Mm-hmm. That's a very, very good practical example to use, because I'm sure a lot of our listeners understand a little bit about what Blitzkrieg was, but probably not the cost, as you said. Are you able to elaborate on what sorts of military power are good examples of the theory, apart from Blitzkrieg? You might use that now. And how military power influences international relations, in 5 words.
5 words.
No, please don't stick to my word limit.
It's all about aircraft carriers.
Elaborate.
But no, seriously, let me give you an example about aircraft carriers, and then talk a little bit about how I think military power influences international relations more broadly.
Yep.
So first, about aircraft carriers. So this is a perfect example of adoption capacity theory. So you have the aircraft carrier, which is invented by the British at the end of World War I. You have the HMS Furious in 1918. Yeah. But it takes 20 years of experimentation by the U.S. and the Japanese in particular to generate the innovation of carrier warfare. Think about the difference between the British, who thought about the aircraft carrier as essentially a spotter for the battleship, mm-hmm. and the U.S. and the Japanese, which began to realize the potential of the aircraft carrier as a mobile airfield.
Yeah.
So it's not just about having aircraft carriers. It's about how you go about using them. And it's carrier warfare, I think, is really interesting because it's just simply one of the single hardest military innovations in history to adopt.
Yep.
Aircraft carriers are incredibly expensive, to say nothing of all of the underlying components and personnel associated with them. And carrier operations are also really difficult. Taking off from, landing on an aircraft carrier is one of the hardest things for a military organization to figure out how to regularize. Mm-hmm. And so, from the perspective of adoption capacity theory, carrier warfare is something that was both extremely difficult financially and extremely difficult organizationally, which is one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of countries really fully grasp and adopt carrier warfare. But it also points to how military power influences international relations. For 500 years, basically, what was naval war? Naval war was ships pointing at each other and firing weapons. First, I guess like literally 500 years prior, you're only at the very, outset of the age of the cannon. But even as distance increases with modern battleships in the late 19th and early 20th century, the fundamentals of naval warfare don't really change all that much.
Yeah.
The materials we use to build the ships change, but tactically, operationally, it's actually not that different conceptually until the carrier. Mm-hmm. And what we see is basically 500 years of what generates naval power, which is the battleship, upended in just a couple of years as naval air power comes to dominate the ocean, and the carrier, because of carrier warfare, displaces the battleship as the beating heart of what makes for a truly great navy. And so you have this rapid transformation in global power, and it's something that is good for, say, rising powers. Country, in this case, the United States and Japan, countries that were more willing to experiment, that were more willing to take chances, and weren't weighed down by the legacy of history. It's not surprising in some ways that the British struggled to adopt carrier warfare because, if, every day you're the best, like imagine like you're really attractive and you look in the mirror and you wake up.
I am really attractive.
Wow, I am really attractive. It's kind of hard to like advocate for self-improvement, right?
Yeah.
So it's really it becomes really difficult for status quo powers, for countries that are already the best at using military power in a particular way, to adopt something that's really disruptive. Which is why it's organizationally disruptive innovations like carrier warfare that can often have the largest consequences for global politics.
It's interesting. I like the examples you've given, particularly the one about me being really attractive.
Of course.
But in terms in terms of podcasts and podcast hosts that run shows named after Prussian theorists, we are number one, so we're probably at risk of being knocked off the top by someone else who comes along and has a desire and willingness to experiment. Now, you talked about some of the state responses to carrier warfare. So I'm interested on how states respond to military innovations. Can you go into a little bit more depth on that?
Sure. So I think a way to think about this is you have the demonstration of a major military innovation by a country. So let's go back to Blitzkrieg, and the Germans invent Blitzkrieg, and you're a country and you're trying to figure out how to respond, and you have a bunch of different sorts of options. You have what I would call internal responses, or attempts to you can try to adopt the innovation yourself, or you can try to counter the innovation in some ways. Remember the fad of tank destroyers?
Yeah.
Those like little tanks that were going to destroy tanks. Yeah. Terrible idea. And then you have external responses. Somebody can invent something and you can be like, man, it's time for us to go Switzerland. It's time to hide in international politics and become neutral.
Yeah.
Or you can try to sort of balance with a likely adopter against this sort of first mover who demonstrated the innovation, or attempt to bandwagon with the first mover. So think about this in the Blitzkrieg context. So the Germans invent Blitzkrieg, and everybody responds differently, right? The French are like, we surrender. The British focus on sort of changing doctrine in air power. The Russians trade land for time.
Yeah.
To try to recover. The U.S. sort of scratches its head and goes, wow, those tank destroyers, those might not actually work. And everybody responds differently. And I think that really sort of encapsulates how that process works, but it kicks off essentially, not necessarily when somebody invents a new technology, but when somebody figures out how to use it.
Oh, that's a very good way of explaining it, and I know now that there's going to be a lot of listeners that are going to now ask for an episode on tank destroyers, so thanks also for giving
Sorry
me...
about that, buddy.
No, that's all right. You're a professor. Giving people research topics is probably a big part of your life. It's not part of mine. Now, how does your theory, and I may be going completely out on a limb here, but I've stolen these questions out of ideas from your book, so hopefully you can talk to them. How does your theory relate to nuclear weapons, Oxford comma, and terrorism?
Oh, so not nuclear weapons, terrorism.
No.
The Oxford comma is important, and I'd like to make a shout out for all those other people that recognize the vital role it plays in all of our grammatical lives. So I would say the part of what I was doing when I was writing this book is I wanted to demonstrate that this notion of adoption capacity was relevant for lots of different kinds of military innovations. So not just the classical ones that one might study in the same kind of sort of course or module where one might read Clausewitz. You might also learn about Blitzkrieg then. You might also learn about carrier warfare then, but also applied to more contemporary issues, including the sort of most contemporary issues.
Yeah.
So for nuclear weapons, the idea from an adoption capacity theory perspective is that financially nuclear weapons are really expensive. So the financial requirements are high, and the underlying technology isn't commercial. It's not like there's at least like let's hope there's not like the black markets for nuclear weapons that you see when you watch TV shows don't seem to really exist in that kind of way.
Yeah, that's good.
But they're really, North Korea demonstrated that you can, put your nickels in a jar every year for, 40 years and eventually get a nuclear weapon. But it's actually pretty hard to do. It's really expensive to do. Organizationally, though, nuclear weapons are actually not that complicated to figure out how to use, in part because the explosive power is just so much larger than other kinds of weapons. And it's one of the reasons why you see organizationally, some countries that integrate nuclear weapons into their existing command structure. Some countries that create entire separate corps to deal with nuclear weapons. So organizationally, they're actually not that complicated. And so, what does this mean? It means that essentially wealth plays a big role in driving the capacity to acquire nuclear weapons, which is different, of course, than who actually does acquire them. But it's a curve that sort of declines a little bit over time, and the relative importance, wealth becomes relatively less important over time. But again, still really expensive, especially because of the willingness of the international community to impose sanctions on countries that seek to acquire nuclear weapons. But nuclear weapons are pretty unique. I mean, it's nuclear, and by that I mean there's only one technology in world history where having the oldest, most busted version of it can get you on the front page of any newspaper in the world, and that's nuclear weapons. Like if you suppose a country was going to deploy an aircraft carrier and they rolled out a replica of the HMS Furious, the 1918. That's like a museum piece. That's a target.
Yeah.
Like that's not even a hard target. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
But if you went online and reverse engineered the Manhattan Project. Even if you built, the most simplistic possible nuclear weapon, that's still actually a big deal for global politics. So nuclear weapons are very unique in that way.
Yeah.
All right, so terrorism. One of the things that I wanted to do when writing this book and thinking about adoption capacity was try to understand the way that terrorist organizations make decisions. I think that and this is a little less true now than when I first wrote the book, but I think especially then, and to some extent now, there's a tendency to see terrorist organizations as either irrational or as just a sort of a bunch of individuals jumbled together sort of with machine guns trying to figure out what to do. And it's not, or even less than machine guns. And it's not that there's not some truth there. But I think terrorist organizations are generally trying to develop optimal strategies in response to their security environment. And that means trying to figure out ways to maximize their bang for the buck. And suicide bombs, for better or worse, are a good example of that. Going back to the sort of financial and organizational requirements for adopting an innovation, financially, very cheap. And, the parts are available, everywhere essentially to build a really good suicide vest different, but, a basic suicide vest.
Yeah, and the parts finish up everywhere as well when it's done too.
Right. Organizationally, though, suicide bombing is actually pretty complicated. I mean, if you look at groups prior to the onset of the suicide bombing era, if you look at groups like ETA and the IRA, the kind of famous terrorist groups in the 1970s and parts of the early 1980s, these are groups actually focused on the survival of their members. That was actually an important part of how they did business and sort of building organizational expertise over time and using that organizational expertise to improve their capacity to conduct operations. Suicide bombing is actually very, very different because it involves like one or more of your members dying as the basis of conducting the operation. And this, I think, proved something that was organizationally very challenging to a lot of the terrorist groups that existed prior to and that succeeded prior to the onset of the suicide bombing era. And so what my research demonstrates is actually a really strong relationship between organizational age and the adoption of suicide bombing, and that it's those sort of younger terrorist groups seeking to sort of maximize bang for the buck and not undermined essentially by the weight of history that proved a lot more likely to adopt suicide bombing in the 1990s and early 2000s, whereas those older, more established groups, it was a lot harder for them to make the transition from other types of attacks to suicide bombing. And so for me, I think what this illustrates is that this notion of adoption capacity has some utility, not just for the, sort of conventional war and military innovations we think about in the context of conventional war, but things relevant for the wars of the present and the future as well.
It's two very, very good examples that are currently at the forefront of a lot of people's minds who are interested in this sort of arena. And I think when it comes to terrorism at the moment, it's not just your NatSec or defence policy driven individual. It tends to be everyone because it's all over our TV screens and in our newspapers. Our newspapers online, of course, because no one reads print anymore. I also can't get over the amount of times you used bang for your buck because I've got an image of a suicide vest salesman using that as his slogan in his catalogue, which is
it's sad but true.
Yeah, so it's a horrible, horrible pun, listeners, but that's why you tune in. Look, Mike, I'd love to sit here and talk about diffusion of military power all day, but two things: one, I don't think listeners will buy your book if you explain everything, and two, it's really, really early here in Australia, and I want to go back to bed. So I have a final question for you. It's what all guests get asked to finish on the show because they need to pay me in some way for me sitting here letting them talk for half an hour. And we have a mission on the show. It's to widen the debate on war, and we do that in Big Carl's shadow. And so we try and define war in as many ways as possible. Each guest gets asked to finish the question, or the sentence rather, war is. So I ask you, finish the sentence, war is.
It's a tough question. Let me boil it down and then explain what I didn't choose. I think, and by that I'm buying myself time to think of a good answer. I think war is about the interaction between organizations. And I think it's important to think about it that way because even in a, sort of an era of individual, even in a sort of older periods of individualized combat, individual combat only ever, determined outcomes because of the way that organizations decided to employ force. And I think that that's true today, whether we're talking about militant groups, whether we're talking about Australia, whether we're talking about the United States. War is about the interaction between organizations and organizations employing violence.
That's excellent.
And that makes it an incredibly dangerous but important endeavor. Now, I did not say that war is people. I thought about just saying war is people, full stop.
Yeah.
Because, to go really Clausewitz, really Clausewitzian, because it's about, it's about the fog, it's about friction, it's about people making mistakes,
totally
et cetera.
To make it so that you said that anyway, but I won't.
But it's really about it's about all those things, but it's about all those things aggregated into organizational decisions. And I think that's an important context for recognizing the way that militaries plan for and actually fight wars.
It's a very, very good definition. I do have a tweetable soundbite from within that paragraph, noting that you supplied a paragraph when it was a sentence, but war is about organisations employing violence. So I think that's quite good. Look, Michael, thanks very much for coming on the show. Thanks for getting up at that very early hour in the US of 2 p.m. I know it must be tough.
I mean, it's the life of a professor, man.
It's quite a good book for those listeners out there. The Diffusion of Military Power. Jump on Amazon, find it, buy it, read it. I found it at the library, but you should buy it. Also, you can find Michael on Twitter. He's at MC Horowitz. And do you have any other projects at the moment, Michael, you want our listeners to be aware of?
Sure. I'm doing a lot of work right now on things derived from the interest in the third offset in the United States and the relationship between emerging technologies and global politics. I'm doing a lot of work on the proliferation of drones, of autonomous systems, and thinking about the consequences for the future of military power.
That's excellent. Sounds like I have a reason to give you another call pretty soon.
Absolutely.
All right, Michael, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, listeners, so that was a pretty good explanation of a complex topic. I know that I'm definitely squared away on military innovation and international relations now and can pretty much go straight out and start doing it. For those listeners who are not yet tuned into War for Idiots, it is a dumber version of this show, but co-hosted by myself and Rich. We talk about some of these topics just as two complete idiots trying to understand it without bringing in the experts. So hopefully it's a little bit more at the level for those people looking just for humour and can sort of show you what areas you may be interested in deeper diving on. And The Dead Prussian is the show for the deeper dive. Please support the show. Send us your iTunes reviews. Send us your money. Buy our merchandise. It is high-priced, not overpriced. It's actually a good slogan. But it's early here, so I'm going to bed. Until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.